Stern presents extensive coverage of the politics of the autumn statement.
Welcome to Westminster, where in just over an hour the Chancellor will deliver his autumn statement. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, economics editor, Faisal Islam, and business editor, Simon Jack.
Is now the right time for tax cuts, Chancellor?
In the last half hour, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, left Downing Street for the Commons. He's expected to announce tax cuts for workers and businesses, something he said was virtually impossible just a few months ago, and comes amidst the highest overall tax level in 70 years. We'll bring you the Chancellor's statement in full, plus Labour's response, the best analysis and political reaction here in the studio.
And I'm in Hull, where I'll be speaking to business owners, community leaders and many others who will no doubt have plenty to say about the Chancellor's announcements a little later.
Yes, it's Autumn Statement Day, the last big financial event of the political calendar and a big moment for the government. Consistently 20 points or so behind the Labour Party. They'll be hoping to turn around their fortunes. Now, before the Chancellor stands up and delivers his statement, we will bring you Prime Minister's questions. Then Jeremy Hunt will get to his feet and unveil his package of measures and announcements. Now, there has been a steady stream of kite flying, pre-announcements and speculation to keep us busy on programmes like Politics Live for days. We are now certain that there will be some tax cuts, personal, individual ones, and for business too. This, of course, a year out possibly from a general election. Who would have thought we would have had announcements of tax cuts? And there may be another surprise. We'll have to wait and see. But will people feel better off anytime soon? And will there be any political dividend or credit for Rishi Sunak and his government? Now, a year ago, if you can remember that far back, Jeremy Hunt talked about eye-wateringly difficult decisions as he unravelled Liz Truss's doomed economic plan. In September, he said tax cuts were virtually impossible. But today, we're told to expect them. Are the difficult decisions over, Chris?
No, but what they're trying to do is suggest that we're heading into a kind of new economic and, they hope, political phase. So they've spent all year, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, talking about inflation. They argue that they've turned a corner on that because they've met their target of it halving within the calendar year, although it's still well above the overall
Bank
target
of
getting
target,
to 2%. And as you might just have noticed, there's an election on the horizon. So they want to sound a little more economically upbeat. But the change of tone and language in the last couple of days has been really quite something.
Yes.
Because until a matter of weeks ago, whenever there was a question around tax cuts, inevitable when you look at the size of the tax burden at the moment, they would say, oh, the only tax cut, as they would describe it, that really matters is dealing with inflation, blah, blah, blah. And they would just sort of kick the can down the road.
But they've sort of parked that a bit.
A little bit, but then more than that, you had that speech the other day, quite unorthodox for a Prime Minister to give an economic speech 2 days out from a fiscal event, as Westminster likes to call days like this, in which he was falling over himself to say tax cuts, cutting taxes, every other sentence. It wasn't one of those political speeches where you had to kind of look at the subtext.
No. It was clear, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was abundantly clear. And the interesting thing, one of the first things actually to measure, I think, this afternoon against, particularly on the whole question of tax cuts, is does what we hear from the Chancellor match the rhetoric that we heard from the Prime Minister? Both what is announced today, but then also what might be hinted at or indicated could be coming in a budget in the spring.
Well, let's put the sort of announcement of tax cuts coming, as you say, politically extremely interesting, bearing in mind what had come before. If we just have a look at this graph, Faisal, and our viewers can look at it too. Tax as a percentage of GDP from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, well, that's also very clear. I mean, just look at the figure. Trajectory for 27-28, 37.7%. As Chris was saying, it would be the highest on record. tax cuts coming. Will they change that figure? Will they make a difference to the tax burden overall?
They may temper that trend, but the sorts of scale that we're hearing about, even if that was the only thing that happened, wouldn't change it hugely. But there is a question as to the detail of what we get. We're expecting the National Insurance Bill, yes, to be reduced. But is that all we're going to get on tax today? For example, could they extend the freeze to thresholds, which hugely outweighs these sorts of moves? As you'll hear from Paul Johnson, I think, from the IFS in a moment, I mean, they've calculated that freeze and thresholds that Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor, is still First Lord of the Treasury, we should not forget, at number 10, so he still has the ultimate responsibility. When he decided to freeze those thresholds, it was worth about $7 billion a year. Then they extended it, they expanded it, and that hit the brick wall of very, very high inflation. And the net result is that could be worth by 2028 $50 billion a year. And I remember when I first heard that figure, I said, so over how many years is that 50 billion? Yeah. They're like, 1 year.
Yeah.
And so that is 6-7 pence.
To check, it is just 1 year.
It is 1 year, and that's in 2028. So the sorts of quantum we're talking about, is it a tax cut? Is it a partial refund on a significant tax rise?
And the curiosity, I think, in the whole political conversation here, which is that there's almost a bias in political reporting in the direction of what is seen to be an action, as opposed to not doing something. So if at a moment like this you get a tax that is put up proactively or taken down proactively, there follow the headlines. When a decision, because a decision not to act is still a decision, it is taken to leave, say, a threshold where it is. There isn't that bong at the start of the news and thresholds have stayed where they are. But the cumulative effect of that over time, particularly at a time of high inflation, is, as Faisal says, extraordinary.
Yes. I mean, in terms of what else we might be expecting, we've also been leaked, briefed, clearly told that there will be an awful lot for business, because also the discussion has turned to growth.
That's right. This is going to be a business-heavy budget today. The centrepiece of it will be what they call full expensing. This is where companies, which they currently can at the moment, anything they spend on new machinery, new equipment, they can offset that against their profits, essentially get a 25% tax cut. That's due to be phased out in March 2026. What we'll hear today is they're going to make that permanent. That is there to get, and investment will be the theme of the entire budget, getting businesses to invest in themselves, getting individual savers to invest more in the UK, and getting pension funds. Expect to hear about the Edinburgh reforms to get pension funds to invest more in the UK. So investment's going to be a key bit of it. Businesses will like this. It comes at a cost. It's probably the single most expensive measure we'll see today, about £9 or £10 billion a year. But also they're going to make that permanent. The Labour Party have said they'll back it. So businesses have been calling this for a long time. So I think that will go down pretty well.
If it goes down pretty well, will it amount to any massive change in growth forecasts?
Well, there is some evidence that the previous regime, something called the super deduction, where you got extra money for every pound you invested, and the current scheme has seen business investment go up a bit. But there are people who have been mindful that it was going to be phased out. So there is some thought that people have brought it forward, that investment they might have done in future years, and they brought it forward to this. Will that, does that distort it? And what you'll get is an evening out over time. The secret sauce for the Chancellor is productivity. That's how efficient companies are. And that has been chronically poor. And that's because business investment in the UK has been at the bottom of the league of all other G7 countries, similar advanced economies. That's what they're trying to stimulate. And if you get productivity, it means you can grow faster without pushing up inflation. That's the holy grail, and that's what they'll be trying to aim at today.
Right, well, let's return to some of the key data, because as you were saying, Chris, inflation, of course, was the main target of the government of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. And when he stands up at the dispatch box in just over an hour's time, he'll also have forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibilities. He sets out the measures and the state of the country's finances and the economy. Inflation was certainly their goal, that pledge of halving it. As you said, let's just have a look. You can see it's broadly under control. But as you reminded our viewers, it's still 2.5 times more than the Bank of England target of 2%. And there's been a little bit of discussion about whether governments actually bring down inflation or whether it's actually the Bank of England with its various interest rate rises. But it did lead to, again, the tone changing with the Prime Minister and Chancellor saying the economy is at a turning point. But let's just remind people that although the rate of inflation has come down, look at the change in prices from 21 to now, or pretty well now, last month of this year, because prices are still rising. They're rising more slowly, and the increases in that period of time are pretty well baked in. 25% for clothing, 30% for food, and a whopping 82% for energy. And the question is, with those figures, even if the government has met its target to halve inflation by the end of this year, do people feel better off?
And the answer for most people will be no, they won't. Even if there is a sense now that for many people earnings might be increasing marginally greater than prices now. But I think the diminishing returns politically of an argument that you hear from politicians about quote unquote sort of dealing with inflation is that, to make the obvious point, but it's worth making, this is not about prices falling. It just means they're rising at a slower level than they were, and those increases are kind of baked in, and people feeling that sense, that core sense, beyond all of the numbers and arguments that we'll hear today, of people feeling less well off than they did in the past. And I think that's the argument we'll hear almost come what may today, whatever we hear from the Chancellor, is part of the critique from Labour.
We're just about to talk to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before we do, we were told by the government time and again over the past year they wouldn't do anything inflationary, won't do anything that might lead to inflation ticking up again. Well, what about tax cuts? Is there a risk, or is there...
Specifically told, as you said, that it was virtually impossible by the Chancellor. Yeah. This is quite interesting. Something has specifically changed over the past month from what we hear from the Chancellor on tax cuts. And they will argue that it's this inflation going down. But from what I understand, there may have been a change in the forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility, because although, as we will see, many of the forecasts for growth will be as sort of anemic as we have come to expect. So you don't get it from there. They do perhaps say that the tax kind of how plentiful the UK economy is in tax, that has increased, and they're changing their assumptions about that, and that is what is driving what they argue is room for manoeuvre, but is it real? Right,
Rishi Sunak just leaving number 10, heading for the House of Commons, because in just over half an hour's time we will have Prime Minister's questions. It's the sort of warm-up, if you like, on a day like this when the Chancellor is delivering his autumn statement. Let's talk to Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Hello to you, Paul. I'm going to put the graph back up, the tax as a percentage of GDP, with the trajectory by 27-28 of a record high of 37.7%. How likely is it that the overall tax level will come down anytime soon?
I think that's quite hard to achieve. Whatever the forecasts we've got going forward, we know that spending is higher than it's been. We know that debt interest payments are at certainly modern record levels, and I expect their OBR will be forecasting them to go up even further. So even if the Chancellor manages to squeeze some tax cuts in the short run, my guess is that the tax burden towards the end of the period will be not very dissimilar to what you're showing on that chart. However you tweak taxes now, we are in a position where debt is so high, debt interest payments are so high, spending is so high, we've got demographic change really beginning to hit. My guess is that that chart is not going to turn decisively down, well, possibly not in my lifetime, but certainly not over the next 5 years.
Well, obviously, we hope you live a very long time, Paul. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, how come then we're hearing about tax cuts today? Where's the Chancellor getting the money from?
Well, my guess is, as you heard Faisal say, the money is coming from both higher inflation, higher wage increases, higher corporation tax receipts. So there is more tax coming in. So if there's more tax coming in for a given rate of tax, you can cut the rate and still keep the tax coming in. So, for example, relative to what the OBR and what the Treasury was expecting just back in March, simply keeping to current policy will raise an awful lot more, actually, from freezing those income tax thresholds and allowances. So to some extent, if we get a headline tax cut, it's really just offsetting some of those unintended increases that we're getting relative to the forecasts back in March.
Right, he could have chosen, of course, we don't know, of course, for definite, but he could choose to reduce borrowing a bit more.
Yes, that's always an option open to chancellors. Do they, if things look better, do they bank the money or do they spend it? Now, what we've actually seen really all the way since 2010, and this is one of the reasons actually that the fiscal position is as it is that broadly speaking, when chancellors have been presented with slightly better economic news, they tend to spend most of the additional money that becomes available. But when they're presented with slightly worse economic news, they tend to push out the hard decisions and borrow more. And that, of course, is one of the things that over the last decade and more has ratcheted up the level of our debt.
Right. We're talking about the freezing of tax thresholds, which has brought in so much money. How many people are we talking about being dragged into paying higher rates of tax, Paul?
We're talking about several million. We're talking about something like an 80% increase over this period from, say, 2020 through to 2028. So something like 4 million additional higher rate taxpayers. That's a quadrupling relative to where we were 20 or 30 years ago. And that really is important. It's a change in the structure of the tax system. We used to think of the tax system as a basic rate paid by the large majority of people and a higher rate paid only by the really quite well off. We've now got a basic rate still paid by people on average earnings, but a higher rate paid by quite a lot of people on not very much above average earnings. And of course, then once you go above £100,000, you've got these higher rates, 60% and 45%. Those higher rates are now paid by pretty much as many people as were paying that 40% rate 20 or 30 years ago. So we've now got a real three-band, or actually four-band structure.
Thanks very much, Paul, and we'll come back to you, of course, once we've heard from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Well, what about how today's announcements from the Chancellor might affect you? Well, the BBC's political editor for Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Tim Iredale, there he is in Hull, at Marfleet Community Hull there. Would you tell us who you're going to be talking to?
Yes, hello, Joe. I'll introduce them as I go along. Welcome to Hull. We are in Marfleet in the east of the city. This is a city that's got a lot of positive stories to tell right now. There's a lot of investment, many new businesses, new jobs being created. But traditionally, this has been a very low-paid city where a lot of people are on long-term benefits. So with that in mind, many will be watching today's autumn statement very closely. Let me introduce first of all Becky Hart, who's the Regional Director of the CBI for Yorkshire and Humber. What would be a good autumn statement for you?
I think for CBI members, it will be all about measures that can really help boost investment and boost growth in the economy. We know that 62% of consumers are spending less on non-essential items, so we need to see some of that growth coming from the business community.
And what do you think to what you've heard so far? Because we know an awful lot of what's going to be in the statement, don't we?
So obviously we've seen some encouraging signs already, but what we're really hoping to get is full capital expensing made permanent. We're hoping to see elements on really kick-starting businesses' ability to decarbonise, but also mobilise their workforces as well.
Scott, welcome. Just tell us a little bit about your business and what you want to hear from the Chancellor.
My name's Scott Tompkinson. I run Humber Driving Solutions. We supply temporary drivers and training to companies in and around Hull. What we're looking for out of the statement is tax breaks, corporation tax, VAT breaks, stuff like that. To run a business at the moment, the taxation is absolutely astronomical. And a lot of businesses are struggling because of the tax and the amount of tax we are paying as a companies. The
Chancellor has promised tax cuts for businesses. How hopeful are you that it will benefit you?
I think it's a decision that's too late for a lot of businesses. I've dealt with a lot of businesses that have gone to the wall because of this. So what he's promising, personally, I think it's too late. It really is too late now.
Kate, you're based here in this community centre in Marfleet. Tell us what you do and what you want to hear from Mr Hunt today.
Yeah, so we're Tyne Bank Hull and East Riding. So we're part of what we would call a solidarity economy, where we bring people together to share time, where everyone's hours worth the same. So that's about bringing people together to support each other. But ultimately, with all grassroots community organisations, they're really feeling the impact of the lack of investment in public services like the health system, the mental health system, within local councils and everything. So, and this has an ongoing impact on people's ability to work and
So if it came to a straight choice between cutting taxes and investing more in public services, which would you go for?
I don't think it's a simple answer. I don't think it's just that. Obviously, small local businesses need more support, but then also there's a knock-on benefit if you take a systems perspective on this, on a lack of public services and the impact that has on the health of the community.
And you're a hotelier and a restaurateur. Tell us a bit more about your business and what you want to hear from the Chancellor.
We're a small boutique hotel and restaurant, so we're basically a bit of a community hub for Sunday roast dinners and things like that. So we're bringing together quite a large part of the community. So for me, the living wage increase is quite positive. Hopefully that'll see that people will be able to afford to go out and enjoy each other's time again. So important at the moment after the past few years. But you know, from the Chancellor, although the capital investments taxes possibly being increased, that would be beneficial in our planning for future business. Being a new business, it's a little too late for us now.
So this tax break for buying equipment, IT equipment, plant, etc. How does that affect your business? How would you benefit from that?
Well, as a new business, we're still looking to develop in other areas and to continue to plan and build more aspects of our business. So at least now we have a bit more time to make that planning. Put that planning into place rather than sort of knee-jerk investment right now to try and get in before the previous deadlines that were there. So it does provide us with a little bit of extra time to responsibly invest in developing the projects.
What about the cut to national insurance? How will that affect you and the people who work for you?
Very positive. If cuts to national insurance will helps out a little bit with the increase in wage bills that we'll have. We're always struggling for employment. So I think that's across the board in hospitality. Quality employment and training of that quality employment obviously comes at a cost, and a lot of people are moving down south to achieve those higher wages. So cuts would help.
I want to just come back to Becky if I can, because locally we are expecting quite a big announcement from the Chancellor today, and that's a devolution deal for the City of Hull and East Yorkshire with an elected mayor. Now, what impact will that make? Because this is the last piece of the kind of northern devolution jigsaw here in the north of England, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the business community would really like to see a devolution deal with an elected mayor be announced for Hull and the East Riding of Yorkshire. It is the only area of Yorkshire that wouldn't have one, and I think it's a really great opportunity to put the region on the map, have our voice heard, and also encourage inward investment into the region.
You agree, Scott?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Hull's a wonderful place. It's got a massive amount of potential. There's a lot of skills here as well that are not being tapped into.
Thank you all for now. More reaction from Hull a little bit later, but you have what? Little under 50 minutes to wait until the Chancellor gets on his feet. Back to you, Jo.
Thanks very much, Tim, there at the Community Centre in Hull. Let's pick up on some of those points, Simon. Interesting that one of the guests Tim was talking to reiterating an ongoing problem about struggling to recruit staff and, of course, the national living wage. We knew this already, but it is going to increase by more than £1 to £11.44 per hour from April next year. What's been the response?
Well, in some sectors, it's been pretty angry response, actually, because if in leisure and retail, for example, which has a high preponderance of people at or near the living wage, not only have they put it up by 10%, which, of course, to those people receiving it will be very welcome, but they've also reduced the eligibility of it from 23 to 21. And that has brought a whole lot more people into that bracket. And so retail bosses said to me, some businesses are looking at a 15 to 20% rise in their wage bill. They also say we're going to have no choice but to pass that through to our consumers in higher meal prices, drinks prices, etc. And how can you tell me that's not inflationary? And so there you have one thing which people do find is inflationary. On the other side, I expect the government to argue that we're going to increase the supply of labour. They're going to try and tackle this 2.6 million people who are on long-term around sickness. That's a 20% increase in the last year or two. And they're going to say they're going to shrink the size of the carrot of benefits and sharpen the stick of the eligibility for those benefits. And I think that could prove quite controversial.
Yes, Chris, and we've been discussing this on Politics Live. They've been quite clear about the direction here. Yes, definitely a lot more stick and far less carrot, because they feel, the government, they're failing to get people back into work who are on sickness benefits, and also the implication that some people just don't want to work or are refusing to take up job opportunities.
Yeah, and I think we'll get a bit of that from the Chancellor shortly. In fact, I've just been sent what's known as the readout from the Cabinet meeting that happened this morning, around about 8:30 this morning, which gives us some sense of the sort of broad tram tracks of the language we're likely to hear, I think, from Jeremy Hunt, and in particular on this whole issue of trying to get people back to work.
Yes.
An observation in Cabinet this morning from Mr Hunt, I'm told, of 100,000 people being signed on to benefits with no requirements to look for work because of sickness or disability, a waste of their potential, and for moral and economic reasons there needs to be what's described with capital letters, or at least capital letters at the beginning of each word, their back to work plan, which we'll hear from Mr Hunt shortly around how they do this. The government has been wrestling for the last couple of years, since the pandemic actually, not just around those who are perhaps not working because of sickness or disability, but also those who've just chosen to absent themselves from the labour market, about how as a government you go about trying to incentivise people to return. And all sorts of conversations have happened in government with some sense that it's tricky, it's difficult, but it hasn't necessarily worked.
Particularly, one of the arguments put forward, particularly by Labour politicians, is that when you look at the size of the NHS waiting lists, if people are waiting for treatment for months on end, how can you do anything about that large number of people who are still on benefits and can't work?
And I think we'll hear that as part of their critique as well. Just one broader point from that Cabinet readout, whilst I'm talking about where our conversation started 15 or 20 minutes ago. Explicit language in that conversation at Cabinet this morning about the UK's economic policy changing gear. So just a sense of the language.
I mean, how important is all that tone and sentiment? Because in the end, if there is no political dividend for Rishi Sunak's government, I mean, we can say they've had an awful lot of resets, haven't they, since September, because we've had, you know, the conference reset, we've had the reshuffle reset, we've now got the autumn statement, and those polls have remained stubbornly difficult. Is this the final sort of roll of the dice before election year rolls on next year?
I think there'll be more rolls of the dice.
I mean, they've got the budget, of course.
Yeah, the dice will keep rolling, I think, all the way until election day, really. But yeah, when you speak to Conservative MPs privately, there is exasperation that this has been an autumn where you've seen the Prime Minister pull various levers, rhetorical, political, economic, and from their perspective they feel that nothing has changed. So you had a conference speech which tried to define the Prime Minister against the previous 30 years, and then you fast forward a few months and you see a personification of a part of that time, the now Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, sitting around the Cabinet table. And then you had that speech the other day with the emphasis on tax cuts. But what was also quite interesting about that was that there was more of an attempt from Rishi Sunak to own the legacy of the last 13 years. But at the same time, there was a very sharp and personal reference to Liz Truss, who was obviously part of that, albeit as Prime Minister, a very small part of that.
Right, well, let's just go inside the House of Commons chamber. It is starting to fill up, as expected, on a Wednesday. We've got just over 15 minutes until Prime Minister's questions, and then, of course, that all-important statement at 12:30. Jeremy Hunt probably speaking for about an hour, and then the Shadow Chancellor for the Labour Party, Rachel Reeves, will stand up and give her response. We'll also hear from the SNP and Liberal Democrats. But let's go to Central Lobby, just outside the House of Commons chamber, and talk to two backbench MPs. There's Miriam Cates, Tory MP from the New Conservatives group on the right of the Conservative Party broadly, and Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP, and who was Shadow Business Secretary under Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome to both of you. Miriam Cates, first of all, what do you want to hear from the Chancellor?
Good morning. Well, I think I'd like to see some tax cuts, of course.
Well, I think you're going to get those by the sounds of it.
But I think they need to be very much targeted around helping with the cost of living for ordinary people, and particularly tackling some of the cliff edges that we have in our tax system that really provide a brake on productivity. So specifically, one of the policies that our new Conservatives group has been lobbying for is a big increase to the VAT threshold. So at the moment, lots of businesses, lots of sole traders, people in trade almost have to stop working as they approach the £80,000 turnover mark, because it's just not worth registering for VAT, having to charge that extra 20%. We could radically increase that £80,000 threshold and see a great increase in productivity in those kind of businesses who could then expand, employ people, take on more work. And then again, around the higher income child benefit charge, we've lobbied for that to be scrapped, because for some families at particular income level, they're at the moment paying 70% tax as they try and earn more money. So there are tweaks like that aren't massively expensive, but could provide a huge boost of productivity, which is what our economy needs right now.
Right, I mean, is the Chancellor listening to you? As you say, you've done lots of work on this, Miriam. Is he listening to what you're saying?
Well, we'll see, won't we? I think there's been trailed the national insurance cut, which of course is welcome, but I think it's about how that is targeted. 1 pence off national insurance is of course welcome, but really it's the thresholds and the cliff edges that are going to make the most difference to people.
Right, Rebecca, would you welcome cuts to national insurance for employees and employers, or should Labour be a little bit more ambitious with its own policies and prospectus in terms of tax and spend?
Well, certainly I welcome the sentiment of what Miriam set out, but I think the government has to recognise that over 14 million people in this country are currently living in poverty. 4 million of those are children. And the winter looks very, very bleak for them. So this autumn statement has to have an urgent anti-poverty strategy within it. Now, there are a number of measures the Chancellor can take. We've heard forecasts that there's £20 billion of headroom. So, for example, he could make a number of measures, such as reinstalling the £20 cut that was made to universal credit a while ago, taking away the 2-child benefit cap limit to universal credit, and urgently increasing local housing allowance so that people who are in a housing crisis can actually afford to rent in their localities, because the fact is that we don't have enough council housing provision because the government hasn't been investing in council homes. Now, beyond that, of course, we need to see a plan to improve productivity. The economy is stagnating, and we need to see real investment in our public services, in our schools, and also in research and development and industrial strategy. And that's what I hope the Chancellor will set out today.
Right, Rebecca, if the Chancellor announces the tax cut, a tax cut to national insurance, will you support it?
Well, we'll have to see the details of that. But the problem is with previous tax cuts that the government have announced, they've often only benefited higher income earners, and very few of those on lower incomes have actually gained any real benefit from this. There's a crisis, and I don't think tax cuts alone are enough to address the poverty crisis that we're seeing, and that's why we need to see urgent investment in our welfare system.
Right, I mean, why should anyone vote Conservative now, Miriam? Even if there is a tax cut, it's a drop in the ocean when you look at the overall tax take and some of the issues and policies that you've outlined. 20% behind in the polls. Why should anyone vote Conservative?
Well, I think the biggest tax on people is inflation, and we've seen astonishing levels of inflation over the last year,
and they're still
2
high.
years. But we have halved that inflation. It's still too high, of course it is. But that is the number one tax, if you like, that has been causing this cost of living crisis. It's putting prices up for everybody, especially people in poverty, the people that Rebecca rightly described. And I agree with a lot of what she said. I absolutely think we should scrap the 2-child benefit limit. I think it's wrong. But I think we need to look at the structural issues behind some of the problems we've got in our economy. And really, the big issue we have is debt. Rebecca is right. It is being reported that the Chancellor has some headroom, but actually it's not headroom at all. It's just slightly less debt than was predicted. I think this year we will pay £83 billion just to service our debt. That's more than the school project. If the school's budget, if we are serious about tackling the cost of living, about tackling long-term poverty, We have to get the debt down. That's what's causing huge waste of public spending and high taxes.
Right. I mean, in terms of actually doing something transformational, Rebecca, why is Labour only saying, Rachel Reeves particularly, that she's broadly going to stick to Conservative spending plans? She hasn't categorically stated that, but she doesn't want to do anything radically different at this point.
Well, I understand at this stage we don't know when the general election's going to be, and we don't know how bad the economy is going to be when Labour comes to power. So she's right to be careful in setting out her stall on this. But ultimately, as a party, hopefully over the next few months, we'll have to start giving businesses some long-term certainty as to what an industrial strategy under a Labour government would look like. We do need to invest. I don't think it's the case that anybody would think that we can cut back on spending in those areas, because to have a productive economy, you've got to provide it with the tools it needs. It needs to have skills, and that means that we need to ramp up investment in higher education, further education, and within our schools. We need to have infrastructure. And that's why we need to see huge amounts of investment, particularly in transport and particularly in the north, who only gets a small proportion per head compared to the south. That will encourage further business investment. And then beyond that, we've just got to compete with other leading industrial nations when it comes to investing in things such as research and development. We're lagging behind. We're not a world leader. We've got the greatest minds in the world, but they're not being supported by the government in their endeavours.
Right, well, thank you both of you. Long list of demands there. I've taken some notes from both of you. Miriam Cates, Rebecca Long-Bailey, I'll let you take your seats in the House of Commons chamber for Prime Minister's questions, followed by that statement. Let's pick up on a couple of things that were said there. Miriam talking about interest debt payments and the soaring cost, of course, of those. But let's have a look at the borrowing forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. Take us through those figures and why they are still so high.
They are very high, and what you're going to see, and what's incredibly interesting for me in terms of what comes out of the OBR this afternoon, is that, if you like, the fight between the fact that interest rates are higher, so that will all things equal push that up, and the fact that we're seeing this, what we call fiscal drag, where all of this tax revenue comes in, hitting up against the barriers of frozen thresholds. And it looks like the latter is winning. So those may be in a better position, where, as I said a month ago, they definitely thought that that was going to be worse because of the interest bill. But I want to pick up on something, because it's really important to clarify this. Both of your MPs there used the word headroom, right? Yeah. And as a shortcut, it's understandable that we say that that is spare cash, right? But that couldn't... Well, it can be quite misleading. What we have is a self-imposed constraint on borrowing, right? And they come in different forms, and the one that is biting right now is not the borrowing, that is the annual extra borrowing year to year. It's the level of debt, which is when you add all of it up, cumulatively, the percentage of national income. And it's just below 100%, and they need to get that coming down.
And they need to stick within, or they feel they certainly need to stick within.
This is, you know, it's an inexact science. It's all about kind of forecasting two big numbers and whether they kind of touch or reach, or whether they, you know, are they within 6 billion or each other. It is extraordinary that it becomes determinative of policy, right? I'll say that. And I think what it doesn't, sometimes it can be communicated that there are no choices. There are still choices. And one of the big choices here is inflation has brought in lots more tax revenue. Is that real revenue? Well, is it real?
Is it illusory?
Is it a bit of an illusion? Because naturally, everything you spend on public spending has also gone up in price. Right. So to maintain the service levels of public services, and some might argue the public have noticed that the service levels in the NHS, in education, in the court system, and all that sort of stuff.
But spending has still gone up on some of those key services.
So there's two issues here. There's where has the money gone?
Yes.
But then also, you know, given that inflation is higher than we expected, if you want to maintain service levels, then would you choose to spend any spare cash on tax cuts now? You know, is that that is the political frame now from the Conservative Party? But actually, is it where the public is? I mean, I just throw that out there. We have choices.
On that, there is a political choice, isn't there? Because, as you say, yes, you can use it however you want to describe it, the headroom, the illusory money from borrowing a bit less. If you stick within those rules, you could use it for tax cuts. You could put it into more spending for public services, or you could pay down a bit more of or reduce your borrowing in that sense. So what is the row?
Indeed. Or you could have, just to take one further step on from Faisal's analysis there, you could have an entirely different framework that didn't set the parameters in the way that the government currently chooses to do. Now, that is a broad parameter that is accepted by plenty of other political parties, broadly speaking. But that's not to say in a different world you couldn't have configured that more differently. And then just to make the more obvious point around inflation, just to sort of land that key point that you were just discussing, that yes, things, as our graph earlier was pointing out, are costing us more when we go to the supermarket and all the rest of it. It's also costing government more when it's trying to spend each pound of either borrowed or taxpayers' money on paying for a public service, and gets at least to part of the discussion that I think will be a big part of the conversation we're going to have in the general election campaign about whether public services are as good as they should be, and are people getting value for money? Is the government getting value for money for each pound it's spending on various elements of public services, particularly in that context of the amount that is currently being spent on servicing, paying the interest on the national
which
debt.
costs a fortune. I mean, it's interesting because there isn't much polling around just at the moment in terms of what would the public like, because the government has had this internal row within the Conservative Party about tax cuts. We need tax cuts, say parts of the party. Well, what about putting that money into public services? Would the public, if you put that question to them, would they say, I'd rather better public services, and I'd be happy for maybe the tax rate to stay the same, tax take, I should say, to stay the same. If you were to pay more tax, they might say no.
And this is the fascinating conversation around the political psychology of where the electorate is. So you can point factually to where the tax burden currently is, and you can point factually to the size of the state and make comparisons historically in the UK. Others will make comparisons, by the way, with countries around Europe.
Well, I was going to say, we don't, actually, the tax take isn't as high as a percentage of GDP as other countries like France,
that's another
Germany.
choice you can make in terms of how you frame the conversation.
So I think the key thing in terms of how this lands with the public is, however, they want to put limits on this borrowing. They want to show the markets there are limits on this borrowing. And this is a mechanism through which this is communicated. This famous credibility, we saw how much it mattered 1 year ago when we were in this room and saw the charts going down before our eyes as I was sat in this place. And the knock-on impact of that is mortgage rates, OK? And it seems like that is the sort of metric. And I think if
that means a lot to people, doesn't it? If you are a homeowner, is that metric?
And if the Chancellor in the back of his head is thinking of one thing, you know, just imagine you are appointed Chancellor and the market's calm. You don't really have a big background in economics. That's going to stay with you. He'll be remembering that as he gives that speech, and he'll want to give an excuse at some point in the next 12 months for the Bank of England, not tell them, but an excuse for the Bank of England to cut interest rates.
I mean, that's an absolutely crucial discussion, if you like, between the Treasury and the Bank of England, because if people take from this today, this tax cut, this rise in the living wage is anyway inflationary, then basically mood music means that interest rates and therefore borrowing costs and mortgage rates stay higher for longer, and that is politically toxic.
And the Labour Party will make an awful lot of that, won't they? Let's come back to this if we've got time. Just before Prime Minister's questions, we can go back into the chamber. I should think it's almost full as we're coming up to midday. Yes, you can see it there, everyone waiting for Prime Minister's questions and then the statement. But let's just take you through the expected measures that we've been talking about. The minimum wage to increase to £11.44 from April next year. The cut, as we've been talking about, national insurance. Yes, that's been announced, of course. Cut to national insurance by changing level or thresholds, we expect. Tax breaks for businesses, as Simon's been saying, with full capital expensing extended. That's deducting capital expenditure on things like machinery from profits. 110. We'll have to get you to go through all of those, Simon, measures to boost the economy and drive growth. I think we can go on to the next set. Tougher benefit rules we were talking about in the Back to Work plan. Now, benefits to increase by September 6.7% inflation figure. I'll come back to that in just a minute. And pensions could increase by earnings figure 8.5%. Just briefly, Faisal, before we go to Prime Minister's questions, there was some discussion that the government might decide to increase or uprate, I think is the term, benefits, working age benefits, by the lower inflation figure of 4.6% in October, which did seem to set all sorts of hairs racing. It looks as if they are sticking to the 6.7%, and pensions by 8.5%. That's the earnings figure because it's higher than growth or prices. But again, they were looking at stripping out bonuses, one-off bonuses and pay settlements. Again, not happening.
This may be the evolution from 3 or 4 weeks ago to where we are now. They were looking for, if you like, things that they could say were funding any giveaways. And it may be that the extra room for manoeuvre against their own targets has given them enough space to do the normal thing, which is to increase benefits with September's more generous figure, rather than looking for a saving of a couple of billion. And likewise, the pensions. Is it worth the hassle of giving the opposition, at least rhetorically, you haven't kept by the triple lock, when you can just go ahead with it? Is it worth the 400 or 500 million a year savings? These are the sorts of calculations that kind of mediated between number 10 and number 11.
And having let the hair run, you can then say,
no.
people thought,
yeah, speculation.
But we haven't done it.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. And we did certainly talk about
hares
it.
or rabbits?
Yes,
Oh,
well,
yes.
well, it
Yes,
is the
hares running
proverbial
and
rabbit,
rabbits and
isn't it? But you
hares.
can set hares run. Anyway, let's leave all our metaphors and analogies. In terms of certainty for business, do you think there will be more certainty for planning, which is what businesses want?
I expect a big part of this, it will probably won't make the headlines today, but it will cause big rows in the months and years to come. They're going to embrace or ratify something called the Windsor Report, which was basically how are we so bad at building energy infrastructure. It takes 15 years to get a new wind turbine connected to the national grid. Nick Windsor came out and says, I reckon I can do it in 7, and I expect them to do that. What that does mean, though, is that this energy infrastructure, getting it from the places where it's generated offshore, of the east coast of Scotland and Yorkshire, down to where it's used, predominantly in the southeast, you're going to have miles, hundreds of miles of cables, pylons, etc. So we may hear some consultation about how you sweeten that experience for the people who are going to be affected. Are they going to get money off their bills for hosting a pylon or a cable in their neighbourhood?
I think it's a bigger point here, which is, I think there is an impressive sounding, dozens and dozens of these measures, a little bit of microsurgery here and there that adds up to something potentially that will change the game on productivity.
Let's go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, I know the thoughts of the whole House will be with the family and friends of the 4 teenagers who died in a car accident in North Wales. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but let me just say we welcome the agreement reached overnight for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. This is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial step towards ending the nightmare for families of those taken hostage in Hamas's terror attack and also addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Justin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, his government will say that disabled people have a duty to work from home or lose their benefits, as if a suitable job of this kind is something that can be conjured up at will. It should be obvious to anyone that this kind of punitive policy isn't incentivising work, it's simply punishing disabled people who are already among the most marginalised in our communities. So can the Prime Minister do his duty and tell us now how many of the 137,000 jobs on the DWP Find a Job website are roles which specify that you can work from home?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right to preempt the Chancellor's autumn statement later, but let me just say this. I'm proud of this government's record in supporting those with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, not only have we closed the disability employment gap, not only have we increased the number of employers that are now disability confident, we're also making sure that we support those who are most vulnerable in our society, not least with the cost of living payments this year, which include £150 for all those on means-tested disability benefits.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that the measures taken to get us through the economic shocks caused by COVID and Putin's war were right for that time, but they are not the blueprint for the long-term successful economies of the future? It's innovation and skills and investment in these, such as the imminent rebuild of Harrogate College or the 12,000 local apprenticeships we've seen since 2010. These are our foundation, and not the fantasy fairy tale tens of billions of borrowing from the Labour Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right, and I'm proud that since 2010 we've created 5.5 million apprenticeships. And Mr. Speaker, that's the difference between us. We now know that the party opposite want to halve the number of apprenticeships if they were in office. Meanwhile, we want to make an apprentice education secretary. But my honourable friend is right. Labour's plans to borrow £28 billion a year would just push up inflation, interest rates and taxes, undermining all the progress that we've made on the economy. And it's only the Conservatives that will give people the opportunity to build wealthier, more secure lives for them and their families.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the Prime Minister, I know the whole House will welcome the agreement reached overnight. We repeat our calls for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. This humanitarian pause must be used to get the hostages out safely, to tackle the urgent and unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to make progress to a full cessation of hostilities. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the international community has treated the two-state solution as a slogan rather than a serious strategy, and that must now change. Like the Prime Minister, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House in saying our hearts go out to the families and friends of the 4 young men from Shrewsbury who tragically lost their lives this week. It's a living nightmare for any parent, and I can hardly begin to imagine their loss. Mr. Speaker, this week the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history. But I'm pleased he mentioned the 5 pledges because, as he knows, 3 of them are economic, and on a day which we will focus on the economy, I'm pleased to report that we have indeed halved inflation, no thanks to the party opposite. We have indeed grown the economy, and we have indeed reduced debt. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Well, the reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago. And the Prime Minister just claimed that this is all about economic growth. So let me ask him, if a labourer or a care worker is forced to wait a year for an operation, how are they meant to help grow the economy?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. But, Mr. Speaker, I talked about the practical things that we are doing with CDCs and surgical hubs. But he doesn't also seem to realise that the union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of Parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where, thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months' wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
So raising the waiting list by 500,000 is getting things done. He's through the looking glass, this one. I asked the Prime Minister how many people are waiting for mental health treatment. He knows the answer, he just doesn't want to give it. 1.2 million. 200,000 are children, some waiting nearly 2 years to be seen. Would the Prime Minister accept those kind of delays if it were one of his family or friends?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we are doing to bring down waiting lists is to expand the access of patient choice. It's a very straightforward idea to make sure that patients can choose where they get treated, and that way we will bring down waiting lists for mental health and other treatments far faster. Now, the Labour Party's policy on this is a total and utter mess. First, he promised, in his words, to ban NHS use of the independent sector. Then he said he wants more use of the independent sector. His shadow health secretary agreed with that, but then the deputy leader said that she would end it. As ever, you simply don't know what they stand for, and you can't trust a word they say.
As ever, no responsibility for the shocking state of the NHS. The truth is the Prime Minister would not accept those waits for his family, and neither should anyone else. This morning I spoke to an NHS nurse. For many months, Cam struggled to find time to see her 14-year-old son, Mikey, until he became seriously unwell. And now he hasn't been able to be in mainstream education for over a year. Mikey's mum is having to balance nursing with caring and being a parent. And this isn't a one-off. There are families up and down the country in exactly the same situation, working hard, trying to get through the cost of living crisis whilst desperately worried about relatives who can't get the treatment they need. How does he think they feel when they see the Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility and boasting that everything is fine?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing absolutely everything we can to put money into the NHS to bring down the waiting list, because I do want families up and down the country to have access to the healthcare that they need. He's absolutely right, they do deserve it. But then it is incredibly galling, Mr. Speaker, to hear this from someone who, when there are strikes happening in our hospitals and people are being denied access to emergency medical care, not only does he not have the strength to condemn it, he refuses to back legislation that would guarantee all the families that he talked about that access.
This is on his watch. It's his responsibility. 13 years in, and all he's got to offer is trying to blame the opposition for his failures. Over and over again. Mikey's mum. I'll tell you what Mikey's mum said to me this morning, shall I, if you're so interested to hear. She said, and I'm going to quote her, she said, whatever spin the government puts on it, you can't hide the reality for ordinary working people. That's her words. Worth reflecting on. Yes. Now, I'm glad that in recent years, real progress has been made in tackling the stigma surrounding mental health. But the fact remains that the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has doubled since 2010, and suicide is now the biggest killer of men under 45. And they're not just statistics. Every single one is a tragic loss to families and to friends. Politics has the ability to turn this around. It means tough choices. If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work, back to their families, and, crucially, giving them their lives back. This is about mental health. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that, for the first time in the NHS's history, ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. And we can look, because he talks about records, Mr. Speaker, because this is something that no government has done in the past. It's something I'm proud we've done. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train. And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
Steve Double. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to housing that local people can afford is the biggest challenge we face in Cornwall. And whilst we need to build more houses, we need to ensure that they are available and affordable to local people and meet the needs of our rural and coastal communities. Now, local knowledge, particularly from elected representatives, is an important part in ensuring we achieve this. Yet the Leader of the Opposition has made clear that his intention is to ignore or override the views of local people in decisions on planning matters. Can the Prime Minister assure me and the people of Cornwall that under his government, the views of local communities will play a part in the planning process?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents, and I agree with him that housing must meet the needs of local communities, and our Affordable Homes programme is delivering hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. But crucially, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe that local communities must be consulted. In contrast to Labour's plan, which is top-down housing targets, concreting over the Greenbelt and destroying our precious countryside.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us in the Chamber are united in our relief at reports that hostages are due to be released by Hamas in Gaza. But we can't afford to lose sight of what comes at the other side of the temporary pause in hostilities that we are about to see. At the end of 4 days, do we simply see the return to the killing of children in Gaza every 10 minutes? Or do we choose in this House to instead back a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do welcome the agreement reached overnight. And as I said, this is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial first step as we try and resolve this situation and, indeed, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, we want to see all hostages released as quickly as possible, including British nationals, and I would urge all parties involved to deliver the agreement in full. I would also like to put on record my thanks to Qatar for their important role, and we will continue to work with the United States and Israel to ensure the safe return of hostages and maximise the opportunity of this temporary pause to step up aid to suffering civilians in Gaza. It is something that we have pushed for, we've continued to do, and the UK is playing a leading role in delivering.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, ultimately it's not a pause in the killing of children that we need. It is an end to the killing of children that we need. And I can think of no better time than now for the Prime Minister to advocate for that permanent ceasefire. But given that he won't currently do that, will he instead lay the foundations for that two-state solution by finally recognising the state of Palestine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually what the agreement that has been reached demonstrates that it wasn't right to have a unilateral ceasefire, and what was right was to do, as we have done, consistently push for a pause that would allow not just for aid to reach people in Gaza who desperately need it, but also for hostages to be released. That is what we have pushed for, and I'm glad that that is now being delivered versus a unilateral ceasefire, which would have emboldened and strengthened Hamas. And our position on the Middle East peace process more broadly is clear. We do support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I've spoken to President Abbas and met with him to discuss this issue, and we are clear about strengthening the Palestinian Authority and reinvigorating efforts to find a two-state solution. And our long-standing position is that we would recognise the state of Palestine when it best serves the interests of peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's Network North project, which will see the full £1.7 billion put into the Midlands Rail Hub, which will reopen the central platforms at Kings Norton train station, which have been derelict for so long. And can I ask him to bring forward the cash so we can increase capacity on the line and improve journey times? And can he look at my campaign to extend the new Camp Hill line to Longbridge, which will open up access to the new Longbridge Business Park, which he visited earlier in the year, which will be bringing back manufacturing jobs to Longbridge for the first time since MG collapsed in 2005.
Well, I am pleased that my honourable friend's constituency will benefit from the decision on HS2 and benefit significantly from new Network North funding, an additional £1 billion to deliver the Midlands Rail Hub in full. And I know that decisions about Kings Norton are due to be made later this year, which should be good news to him. And the extension of the forthcoming Camp Hill line services between Birmingham and Kings Norton and Longridge will be assessed in due course as well. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm sure the Rail Minister keeps him up to date on progress.
Sybil Roberts. All right, I'm sure the Prime Minister will join me and the communities that I represent in sending heartfelt sympathies to the families and friends grieving at the loss of 4 young men lost in a tragic accident in Carrickglanbrothen this week. People in North Wales pay the highest standing charges on energy bills at £340 a year. That's a third more than London. That's despite having lower average incomes and people there living in older, poorly insulated houses. With a further increase in standing charges due next April, he must recognise that he can't leave this to Ofgem. Will his government, therefore, tackle unfair standing charges, and that before winter sets in?
Mr. Speaker, we have provided an extraordinary package of support for households across the country to help with energy bills, totalling almost £100 billion over the past year or two. The Ofgem price cap has also fallen to around £1,800 currently, and our price guarantee will remain in place till spring of next year, which will provide further protection for families. But crucially, the Chancellor announced previously that we have removed the premium paid by households using prepayment meters until the EPG ends, bringing their costs into line with those paid by comparable direct debit customers, and we continue to provide considerable support for vulnerable families throughout the winter with their energy bills.
Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Setting strategic aims for the Middle East requires us to be precise about the terms we use, and that includes the word peace. Peace is not just the absence of war or conflict, but the freedom from the fear of conflict or oppression or terror. Peace requires mutual respect, freedom from persecution, and living without fear of destitution. It comes with self-determination and liberation from arbitrary justice. It needs hope and dignity and enforceable rights. Does my right honourable friend agree that only when all the people of the Middle East can achieve all of these things can any of us talk about having achieved peace?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with my right honourable friend and thank him for what he says. And I know his advice will continue to be of value to the government as we find a way for a peaceful, more secure future for everyone living in the region.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish surcharge on energy, according to Ofgem, means that people in Scotland pay 50% more in standing charges than Londoners, despite exporting 3.2 million hours of electricity to England in the last 2 months alone. Meanwhile, Scottish green energy producers pay higher charges than English power companies to connect to the grid. Does the Prime Minister think that this is fair to Scotland's consumers and businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I refer to my previous answer about the considerable support that we're providing to families across the United Kingdom with their energy bills. And actually, what would be good, she mentioned Scottish businesses, what would be good is if the SNP realised that they should support the 200,000 people employed in Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest film from Torquay's Unleashed Theatre Company, 3 Steps, outlines the impact of homelessness. What further steps does the government plan to take in order to ensure everyone has a place of their own?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the important work of his local theatre company, Unleashed, and I wish them well in their future endeavours. We are investing an unprecedented £2 billion over the next 3 years to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, including building thousands of move-on homes and implementing our landmark Homelessness Reduction Act, which has already prevented or relieved almost 600,000 households from suffering from homelessness.
Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Why are 34% of children in my constituency living in poverty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this government that has ensured that across our country 1.7 million fewer people are living in poverty as a result of the actions of this government. Yes, that is true, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, hundreds of thousands fewer children are living in poverty, and income inequality is at a lower level than we inherited from the party opposite. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't want any child to grow up in poverty, and the best way to make sure that that happens is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. And that is why the right strategy is to ensure that we provide as many children with the opportunity to grow up with parents in work. And because of the actions of previous governments, several 100,000 more families are in that.
Got it. Durham Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question about apprenticeships. It is vital that individuals of any age can train and retrain for good local jobs, further education and skills opportunities that are available. So will the Prime Minister work with me in my campaign to establish an apprenticeship hub in Broxton?
Thank my honourable friend for all his campaigning on this important issue. We've delivered over 9,000 apprenticeships in his constituency, of great local businesses, including some that I visited as Chancellor, like Hair and Beauty from memory. But while we continue to invest in apprenticeships, we know the party opposite now want to halve that number, and that is the difference between us. Whilst on this side of the House we want to give people a hand up, all Labour want to do is keep them in their place.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With 316 arrivals by small boat this week, last week's Supreme Court ruling on Rwanda has left this government's lack of a compassionate and functioning asylum system totally exposed, with refugees suffering as a result and chaos at our borders. So could I ask the Prime Minister, yes or no, does he now intend to disapply human rights laws in order to continue wasting time and money on this cruel and discredited gimmick?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman mentioned the small boats arrivals. I'm pleased to tell him that thanks to the actions of this government, the number of arrivals are down by over 33% so far this year. No thanks to the party opposite that has opposed each and every single measure we have taken to stop the boats.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Labour leadership at Kirklees Council are looking to close Colne Valley Leisure Centre, hike up car parking charges and being criticised by their auditors for the way in which they manage their resources, there has been lots of good news for my bit of Yorkshire this week. £64 million of levelling up cash for Huddersfield Market and the Penistone rail line upgrade and the West Yorkshire Investment Zone, focusing on the National Health Innovation Campus at the University of Huddersfield. Will the Prime Minister continue to invest in West Yorkshire and come and see some of these fantastic...
Prime Minister!
Well, Mr. Speaker, what great news. What great news. I was delighted to hear that the third investment zone was announced in West Yorkshire, and indeed money for the Penistone Line rail upgrade and regeneration funding for Huddersfield Open Market. But Honourable Friend is right, though. While the Labour-run Kirklees Council is not investing in closing things, it's this Conservative government that is backing communities across the north.
He's not Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, told the COVID inquiry that the now Prime Minister had not asked for advice regarding Eat Out to Help Out. But on the 9th of March 2 years ago, the Prime Minister told this House that, and I quote, "At all steps in the crisis, we have taken the advice of our scientific advisors." Who's right?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, there is an ongoing statutory inquiry into COVID. It's absolutely right that that process is followed. I look forward to providing my own evidence in the coming weeks and addressing all these questions. But it was the case that the government took advice from scientific advisors, and again, that's exactly what this inquiry will go over.
Mr. Speaker, since I recently shared my own experience of birth trauma in this chamber, I've been inundated with mums writing to me from across the UK to share their stories. I received a concerning email last week from a Staffordshire mother who'd like me to raise her concerns about Royal Stoke University Hospital. She also experienced birth trauma and has been told that due to the time elapsed, they will not be able to investigate her concerns. It is not acceptable to me that my constituents are not having complaints investigated by my local hospital. So can I ask the Prime Minister to urgently meet with me to discuss this? And can I also ask him to include birth trauma in the refreshed update to the Women's Health Strategy? We must do better to provide aftercare to all mothers in this country.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue and for continuing to be a fantastic campaigner on birth trauma. I'm pleased that the first ever debate in Parliament on birth trauma was held recently in October. It was powerful, it was moving, and it highlighted just what a significant impact birth trauma can have on so many women's lives. The Department for Health are working with NHS England to make sure that we can improve maternity care and making sure that mental health care is also improved to deal with this. And I will ensure that the Health Secretary meets with my honourable friend so that we can ensure that we get this right for all the women who are depending on it.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 13 years, the 6 oil and gas licensing rounds by the Tories have produced only 16 days' worth of oil and gas for the UK. Can the Prime Minister explain how doubling the number of licensing rounds will have any impact on the insanely high energy bills my constituents are facing? If he cared about energy security, jobs or the environment, he would surely be better matching the Scottish Government's £500 million investment in a just transition and providing a £400 rebate to bill payers.
Mr. Speaker, not £500 million, we're investing tens of billions of pounds in the energy transition, not least with things like carbon capture and storage, which the North Sea can play a starring role in. But it's just completely wrong. In order to have energy security, it's right to exploit the resources that we have here at home. Even the Independent Committee for Climate Change projects that we will still need oil and gas as we make the transition and in decades' time. So the question from the Honourable Lady is, are we better off getting that here at home, supporting Scottish jobs and businesses, or are we better off putting that money in the hands of foreign dictators and shipping it here with 2 or 3 times the carbon emissions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm hosting 14 Ukrainian teenage children here in the House of Commons, whose parents have been and are fighting the Russians in Ukraine. 6 of them have been orphaned. They are up in the gallery, but they will also be in the IPU room from 1 till 2:30 this afternoon. So I know it's a busy and important day, but all colleagues are welcome to drop by if they are able. So will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to the parents of these children and take this opportunity to reiterate our steadfast support for the people of Ukraine in their fight for their independence, their freedom and their nation's survival?
Well, I do join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the parents of these children and many others, but also to take the opportunity to say that whilst events in the Middle East have been dominating the headlines, I can assure my honourable friend that we and our allies are steadfast in our resolve to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to achieve victory. And that's why the Foreign Secretary visited both Kyiv and Odessa last week, confirmed the UK's continued unwavering support for the Ukraine. Putin cannot hope to outlast the incredible resolve or spirit of the Ukrainian people, and they should continue to have our support for as long as it takes.
Daniel Zeitler. A few weeks ago, the world cringed at the Prime Minister's fawning welcome for Elon Musk.
Yep.
And this week, advertisers are fleeing Musk's platform after his latest vile outburst. So what exactly did the Prime Minister think he might learn from an unelected, super-rich individual who'd taken over a once successful organisation and plunged it into a death spiral?
Mr. Speaker, it is striking. It is striking from the honourable member from Cambridge, of all places, to absolutely not understand the importance of technology sectors and companies to the growth of our economy. Absolutely extraordinary. It actually illustrates everything that is wrong with Labour's approach to our economy, Mr. Speaker. What the rest of the world saw was the UK playing a lead in defining the regulations and approach to a technology that is going to transform how we live. It was a great example of the UK leading the way, an enormous tribute to our incredible entrepreneurs and businesses, many of which are being poorly represented by him and his constituents.
Today is Red Wednesday, when we remember millions of Christians and others worldwide persecuted for their faith. People like Margaret Atta, a nurse, a lovely young mother of 4, here today from Nigeria, who hid behind the altar as her church service was attacked. 100 were injured, 41 killed that day simply for being in church. Margaret lost both legs and an eye. And thousands more suffer similarly in Nigeria each year. So does the Prime Minister agree that the best way we could honour Red Wednesday today is to commit to quickly implementing the good words of the new International Development White Paper published yesterday to ensure UK development policies going forward are inclusive of those marginalised for their religion or beliefs?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her continuing dedication as my special envoy for this vital issue. Red Wednesday is an important moment to demonstrate our solidarity with Christians and all those persecuted around the world for their religion or belief. And marking this event annually was just one of the recommendations in the Bishop's report. And I'm pleased that today we will light up FCDO buildings in the UK in red in support. And I'm also pleased to say that we've taken forward all 22 recommendations in a way that we believe is making a real change for those persecuted for their religion or belief.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That's the end of Prime Minister's questions. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Before I call the Chancellor, it may help the House if I set out how proceedings